Hopefully you can all see and hear me now. We are ready to go. If you guys can confirm in the chat whether you're hearing me, and we'll get going. There's a little bit of delay, so it might be a second after you confirm. All right, we got a confirmation. Okay, welcome everybody to the power of graphic composition. And this, for me, it's a really exciting subject because it's kind of a discovery that I made after working for years and years and years and thinking that I was bad at composition. I had friends that were really good at composition. In fact, this has kind of been the story of my life, that I've always been surrounded by people who are way more talented than me, and I just sat there baffled at their abilities. And then after thinking through it and trying to work through some of the problems myself and talking to people about why they were doing what they're doing, I started making some realizations, and this was one of them. This is one that totally changed everything, and it was something that I've never really heard anybody talk about some of these things, but for me it was kind of a life-changing thing to realize it. It's changed the way that I work in these pretty big and fundamental ways. So hopefully you will feel the same way. Now it's going to sound like I'm talking about some really basic stuff, and I am. The reality is that most of the things you are hearing here you will have heard before in art classes or something, but in most cases there'll probably be some rock stars in here because there always are, but in most cases you heard it way too early. And what I'm introducing to you now will hopefully be something that where you're ready at this time in your life to hear these same principles again and have them mean something to you. Okay, so first idea here is, when you look at this image, do you know what the focal point is? The focal point is, of course, the first thing that your eyes are drawn to, and when you look at it, you kind of feel like it's the purpose of the picture, the reason why the picture was taken or painted, or what the story is all about. And most of you will say that it's the frog that is the main focal point. And when I ask why, some of you will give me compositional answers, but many of you will say, well, there's a frog, and of course I'm going to look at the frog. And that's really true. And I think it's important to note that the first thing that we're going to be drawn to in any image is something that we relate to personally, something that we understand. And so make sure that you know that if you've got a character in your scene that's particularly interesting, they are going to by default become the compositional hot point in the image. And you're going to, if you don't want them to be the compositional hot point, kind of fight against it. In this case, you'll notice as I switch modes here that even in this state, when you can't really explicitly tell that it's a frog anymore, because I applied a Photoshop filter to it, maybe some of you still can, but I think if I'd showed you this image without you seeing that it was a frog first, you would still know that that was the compositional hot point. And the reason why is pretty simple. Areas of high contrast draw the eye. And a good way to think of this is, it's almost like when you get the highest contrast point in the image, it's like there's a stake in the ground there, and it's got a rope or a rubber band tied to it. A rubber band is what I meant. So the rubber band is something that just kind of pulls your eye back to the spot. You keep trying to look at other things, you try and explore other parts of the image, and yet you find yourself kind of back at square one every time. So high contrast, really, really powerful thing. And the great thing about this is that it is true across cultures, across the world. Now, you should hopefully know that there's different types of contrast. I mean, you will have known that intuitively, but a lot of you will have experimented with these types of contrast. What you should know is that different types of contrast have a different hierarchy value, meaning that when you look at a difference between texture or a difference between surface, that has the weakest pull to our eyes. When we go back to that rubber band ability of a high contrast point, if you have a high contrast point in texture, it's actually going to pull our eye in the weakest way. Proportion tends to pull our eye maybe a little bit stronger. I think we could make arguments about which one sits at the bottom or the order of these specifically. But hopefully you can see as we move up through shape, saturation, direction, edge, hue, and proximity and value that things are getting stronger and stronger. Again, the exact order of these may not be as important as to understand that you are going to have some features, some elements that you're using where when you apply contrast there, it's going to be more of a background sort of contrast. And other times when you're applying that element in such a way that it is going to command all the attention of the viewer when you put that sort of thing in there. So with that in mind, we're going to talk today about graphic composition, which obviously removes some of those things. We remove some of the soft edges and other things like that. We're cutting out everything and simplifying the graphic composition down to a few things. But there's two ideas of graphic composition that I wanted to talk about. And the first one is that graphic composition, if you can use it the way that I'm going to show you, you can actually isolate each type of composition and deal with that on its own. So in other words, we're going to talk about some different forms of composition, types of composition that you're going to be building on. When I say types of composition, I mean compositional modes or orders. But in this case, when I say different types of composition, I'm talking about like edges, where in the previous one we were looking at, soft edges versus hard edges, or hue changes. And you're going to be using those almost separate from your value composition things. A good example of this is that in this image right here, the girl is the highest contrast point in value, and your eye is drawn to her. And it works really well. Your eye is kind of pulled back and forth, again and again to that compositional point, even though you look at other things in the image. But look at this one and how interesting it is. Because in this case, we doubled up on the fact that we have, this sort of color interest and the value thing going on. We changed saturation there, edges, detail. In this case, we've actually downplayed the girl. And yet she remains a compositional hot point. We've got the strongest value composition down here at the feet. And it allows our eye to kind of ricochet back and forth between those things. And it keeps that composition feeling really interesting. And which way you want to go in terms of how you deal with your composition is going to come down to how quick is the shot going to be? How long do you expect the audience to have to look at this? This one is more interesting to look at for a long time. This one's more interesting and works better for that kind of quick, you see the shot and it's gone sort of scenario. So this is what we'll be talking about today. I want to talk about one of those types of contrast that we were discussing earlier, and introduce to you to the principle of proximity. Some of you have heard of this before, but I want to show you how this works in a compositional sense. So the law of proximity states basically that when we isolate an element, we separate it with low contrast or separate it in space from other elements, then that single element actually becomes a compositional hot point. We are drawn very strongly to that thing. That thing stands out on attention on its own. So this idea of grouping and clustering is something you're going to use a lot in order to essentially call out the stuff that's important. You're going to be squishing things that are separate into corners or into groups. You'll be taking things that are all the same, and instead of spreading them out in almost patterns, you're going to be kind of clustering them together in order to control this proximity. And if you can learn to control that, this actually opens up a new door. Now, if you look at this image that I've shown here, that some of you saw these two main compositional points with the shack here and the thing that's going on back here, that ancient city, and you maybe saw the fish up here. A lot of you might not have seen this little kid standing here. In fact, some of you might have noticed it after looking at it for a while, but it definitely didn't stand out to most of you, I'm sure, right away. And look what happens when we change things. So by clearing out the area and basically introducing some, I guess like by pushing things away from him so that nothing is in proximity of the character, we have now created a hotspot compositionally. What's great about this is this character is not a high contrast point in the image. It's actually relatively low contrast compared to a lot of the other things that are going on here. But because of the law of proximity and because it's so high on the strength scale of contrasts, your eye just goes right there to that kid, almost first thing in this image. So one of the things that is related to this that we're going to be using a lot today in graphic composition is the proximity of detail, and the way that you use areas of low detail to areas of high detail is actually going to be something that you use to control your compositions a lot more than anything else now. So the idea of graphic composition is based on a couple different compositional modes. That one of the most common that we see is a 3-value composition that you can see here, and most images, if they're composed really well, will actually hold up very well when you see that composition in a graphical form, and I'll show you how to do this later. So there's 4 different compositional types. I think I'm going to introduce 3. I think actually there's 5 compositional types, and I think I'm introducing 4 today. So the first one is a single point composition. So a single point composition has one central feature, and I've included the graphical form of this so you can see how it works structurally. That we have the darkest darks and the lightest lights kind of concentrated in this area in that painting. And even though we have whites here, the whites are all against grays. And so our eye knows that this is the main anchor point, and everything else, you can include tons of detail everywhere else, but we're essentially pulled in every time back to that same point. So this is the example I've shown a few different times now. The second compositional type is a multi-point composition. So in a multi-point composition, the eye moves between multiple points, and I've found, just generally speaking, it's much easier to make these work when you keep the shape very simple. So there's kind of a triangular composition here that helps it to work really well. And in this case, you can actually see when we switch to a graphical version of the composition, it's kind of a, I don't know, a rectangular shape that's been skewed in one direction. So this idea of having a multi-point composition is really great if you want people to see multiple things or to keep the eye moving through the piece. Then a path composition is when you have multiple points all along a line. And the thing that's great about a path composition as opposed to a multi-point composition is that a path composition, you can have the line and shapes do all sorts of weird things. You can have them cross over themselves and do all sorts of things that with a multi-point composition, it starts to feel a little bit overwhelming to look at. And so here's a graphic composition. Here's one that is a little bit more rendered, but hopefully you can see the same principle at work in both of them. Then there's a patchwork composition. Now, patchwork compositions, you're going to see these a lot in fine art. You're not going to see them as much in animation, but if you are working in video games, you're going to use patchwork compositions all the time. And there will even be times when it makes sense to do this when you're working in film or TV. But basically what a patchwork composition is that you get multiple isolated compositions, and then we are working with the same rules of compositions within each of those patches. And you can see that kind of happening in both of these images here. Now, I know that there's some questions. I'm going to address them at the end. So those of you in the chat may want to remember the question that you asked and ask it again when we get to the end, because we'll have some question and answer period. So how do you get a graphic composition? I think the best way to start is honestly with a 2-value composition. A 2-value composition allows you to kind of focus on just what is this image really all about. It's simple. It's easy to work on. I would strongly recommend, if you want to get good at composition, to start with a graphic, with a 2-value graphic composition. And there's a couple things that are really nice about that. The best one about it is it actually teaches you to control proximity and detail, what I've been talking about. After you've done a bunch of 2-value compositions, you're going to get a great mastery over this idea of graphic composition. And your compositions in general will get stronger with what you learn doing that. Now, as it says over here on the side, and probably most of you have been reading this the whole time, that was bad slide makeup, but 2-value compositions, while they're great for testing compositions, they're a great exercise, but for more complicated pieces where you're having a lot of color and other things like that, there's sometimes not enough. A 3rd or 4th value can be helpful for that. I'd say 3-value compositions are the most well-balanced compositions. They're the easiest to control, Four value compositions can work, but they're a little bit harder to make work, and we're probably not going to talk as much about them today. So this is where most people go wrong when they add a third value making a composition. So you might start with your two value composition and then put a darken layer in and start adding in that third value. But what people mess up on is they get that third value and they get all excited and then they start shading the image. And I think that's a massive mistake. So instead what you want to do is use that third value to essentially focus on the same compositional principles that we've been talking about so far. How do you isolate elements? How do you make something higher contrast than everything else while still having detail other places? And what is the form of the composition? In this case, you can see we've got a 3-point composition. So that's a pretty important one. We'll come back to that later. Now there's two ways of approaching this. The first one is to start graphical, and I think it's a great approach. It tends to have a couple of pitfalls with it, specifically that you're going to use darken and lighten layers and colorizing and maybe blenders and stuff like that to essentially bring color to your piece. It does mean that you're going to spend a bit of time doing the pre-image and then you're going to be fixing the image after separately. What's great about it is that it does allow you to isolate the different contrast types. So like you can handle your color separately, you can handle your edges separately, you can bring in your texture and surface changes to add interest or to add additional compositional points. And let's actually talk about that real quick. So as we're talking about these many different compositional types, actually we'll go back to that early slide because this is pretty important. This actually becomes a massive asset. The fact that we have really strong ones and really weak ones, it means that you can actually create really interesting compositional points and actually create maybe like a multi-point composition out of proportion, surface, and shape. But then you might have a 2-point composition in saturation, and then you might actually have, using value, proximity, and hue, a 1-point composition. And what this gives you is compositional hierarchy. In other words, you should never have multiple focal points that are the same high contrast level. When we're moving through all of these images, you'll notice that each one has something that's the most important, something that is the second most important, something that's the third most important, and everything kind of descends down from that hierarchy. You never want in a multi-point composition for everything to be exactly the same level of intensity because it gets a little bit grating to look at. It takes a lot of work for our brains to sort through when you start breaking your image out like that. And you can see this is a great example of that. There's a good amount of space that's given in each of these that kind of allows these compositions to live on their own. But also notice how in this background area, there's very little color contrast. They saved the color contrast for up here. They've also got the highest amount of detail contrast as it exists in here. So the lights and darks and the proximity of detail. This area is the most contrast or highest contrast of all the piece. Then this one comes in a close second using values, which I think it works really nice in that area. And then this one really, all it's doing with the composition is applying a couple of textural spots for your eye to be able to pull back and forth between those things. That's a really successful painting. So anyway, let's go back now to, so starting graphical is a great way of doing this. The second way of approaching this is to essentially just paint your painting the way that you want and then assess it using a graphical method, which I'll be showing you in a minute in Photoshop. So the strength of this one is that you don't have to be worrying about the composition the whole time that you paint. The other thing about it is that you can assess and find and fix compositional problems in almost any image. I've done workshops at companies that, I mean, a few of them is just like the average artist was way better than I am, or like the lowest one on the totem pole just blew me away. And I'm just looking and saying, like, how can I even help when I was asked to give a workshop at that company? And then I'd introduce this principle, and it was so interesting because every single time when I introduced this idea of kind of assessing something graphically, we found problems with the image and were able to fix it. And at the end of the workshop, these images that were way better than I could even do myself actually ended up improved as a result of this kind of almost clinical analysis process that really anybody can do. So anyway, let's go into Photoshop and I'll show you some of these techniques. So the first technique that I want to show you is if you create an adjustment layer that's posterized, so that's right here, or posterized, I don't know how you pronounce it. I've only read it, never heard somebody say it to me. And then what I'd do is I'd keep the levels on this pretty low. So in this case, I found that below that, like at 2, the image broke into basically 2 values and it wasn't really useful to me. When I moved up very far past that, then we just started to get the image that I was seeing it. But there's a sweet spot right in between at 5 and 4 where I felt like, let's see what 4 does. Yeah, both 5 and 4 were really nice because essentially it breaks up the values of the image and still gives me all the color breakup. And I think, that ends up being, at least for me personally, this super easy way to essentially assess the image and see if it works. One of the problems with this one is it does change your colors a bit, and so it isn't necessarily an accurate representation of what your composition is, but it may help you to identify problem spots. The second way to assess compositions is to, actually instead of an adjustment layer, what I'm going to do is a luminosity layer, and I've showed this in a couple of things today, so some of you might be tired of seeing this, but I love this tool. It's so great. So I would avoid the top of the spectrum, I would avoid the bottom, but I'd say like somewhere sitting in the middle, and you can test values like this. But basically try, lighter, darker, see which one gives you the most readability while keeping the relative saturations consistent. Because if you drop too low in value, then it starts to be really hard to read. If you drop really high in value, then it starts killing the contrast in colors. What this one's really useful for is looking at your color composition. So when I look at this piece, now that I've kind of done that, because it eliminates all of the value information and kind of crushes it together, now what I can look at is say, what kind of value composition, what kind of color composition is this? And I'm seeing kind of a path composition, but there's all this kind of muddy stuff kind of thrown off to every side. So I may want to work a little bit with that. I don't think it necessarily means that we need to get rid of the browns in every case, but we might want to maybe introduce a new color or introduce a couple of high contrast points, maybe blues against browns or something, so that our eye doesn't see this stuff up here as being important, but that we can be pulled where we need to be. Then the third thing is threshold, and we'll show you in just a second how to really use this, but what I'm going to show you that's nice about the threshold thing, let's show you how to get to that. So if you go down here to your adjustment layers, this little threshold adjustment allows you to create a threshold layer on top. And now if I take this image, and what I'll do is I'll put a threshold on top of each layer, and I like to lock them on top of the layers. What this allows me to do is it allows me to take one of the 2 layers and just turn the opacity back to like 50%, and that opacity change to 50% basically gives me a 3 value composition. And now what I need to do is just adjust those thresholds. So I'm going to try and find the dark values as they exist in the scene, and you may need the original to kind of compare against. And I think our dark values seem to stretch a little bit farther in this image. Maybe something like that feels about right. And by the way, there's a little bit of arbitrary judgment going on here, and you'll just have to do your best to figure out what exactly that means. I think this is probably a good spot for like where that lowest value in this scene exists. And then for our highest value, we're going to go in here, and again I'm going to try and look at all these together. It feels like our highest spots are kind of sitting in this territory. And again, I'll back up so that we can see if we're actually getting an accurate read on that. Looks like those lights are a little bit broader there. So maybe like that. So now we have a pretty good 3 value composition. You can of course adjust that midpoint so it gets lighter and darker as you wish. But now you can assess the piece and start looking at it and saying, is this a multi-point composition? Is it a path composition? Is it nothing? It's like if I were to study this piece, I'd say I'm getting a high contrast point there on this rock. I'm getting one right up here. I'm kind of getting one right there. I'm getting some kind of high jitters there. I'm definitely getting something here, 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 there. I'm mostly looking for where whites kind of meet against black, so maybe something right there, and maybe a little bit of something there. So it's like this is kind of a chaotic composition. Then we're also getting detail composition wise. It's just like there's stuff everywhere that's making it really, really hard to read what's going on. So what we're going to do in today's workshop is we're going to try and fix this image. Now, before we do that, I've talked about a lot of things. Let's go to a quick question and answer, and then I'll go to fixing this image. So let's see what you guys have. Okay, somebody asked if this will be up later. Yes, it will be. Seems like a lot of people kind of talking about classes to go to and stuff. So, unless some questions come up in a second, we might just move on and save the rest of the questions for the end. Okay, somebody asks, what did the gray layer do? So this layer is probably the one you're talking about. This is a luminosity layer. That's all about collapsing all of the values together so that you can remove all of the value contrast and just look at the color composition in the piece. Like I said before, that each type of contrast has its own composition. And if, for example, I were to take this and go, just put a new layer in here. If I were to put like an orange door on this thing, whoops, an orange door on this thing and then surround it with blue shadows, then now this is a single point composition. We've totally just made it a single point composition. Now maybe I do a lighter version of that up here, and I make it so that this rock has kind of a yellow against blue thing going right at the edge. That's more of an orange. We'll go yellow against blue. And maybe I'll even like break that up with a couple things, or we'll introduce some green stuff peppered on that rock. And now we've got a 2-point composition. See how our eye is kind of jumping between that? But that's all just in the values. So if I go back and I just make this a color layer, we've still got the sort of soft effect of the color composition changes that I made, except I missed the doors location. But yeah, the color composition is supplementing the value composition now, instead of just being randomized colors. All right, let's see what other questions you have. Somebody wrote, I don't have questions so far. Well, thank you. That's good. Threshold just collapses the whole image into a single set of light and black, and that's why I had to create 2 threshold layers and link them to layers in order to create a 3-value composition. I could make the PSD available. I am not sure. We'll see if it turns out good. If it turns out bad, I'm not going to. But if it turns out awesome, maybe I'll let you guys check it out. There's a bunch of things about environments and stuff, and we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to keep this about composition. What makes patterns so low on compositional elements? Now, just to keep in mind, you can have a high contrast pattern, and that's going to draw a lot more attention than something that's a lower contrast pattern or something that's scaled down. So you can actually make it using value or color or something else. You can actually make it so that a pattern really stands out. So it's just when you're talking about texture itself, and whether you have texture and whether that texture changes from one thing to another thing. Like if you had 2 high contrast patterns and you put them next to each other, we're not going to feel like you made the image super confusing or anything like that, because they're both going to be about the same contrast level. What is a good way to train your eye to notice problems in contrast? That's exactly what we're talking about right now, and I'll show you how to do that as an assessment thing. We won't talk about natural light right now, although those are good questions. So value grouping, yes, value grouping is how we're going to fix up the image. So great question by April. How do you determine what aspect of composition is weaker or stronger in the spectrum slide? A lot of this has been studied for a really long time. If you read books on Gestalt theory, then you'll find that they've found all of this stuff by experiment. And so, there's still argument even in the scientific community about the exact order in which those things go in, but the general trend of them and as to which ones are stronger and weaker has been really it's been replicated in experiments over and over again. So there's a book called Art and Perception. Oh shoot, I don't remember the author's name, but if you look up art and perception on Amazon or something, I'm sure it'll come up as one of the searches. Then that'll teach you all about Gestalt theory. It's super long and crazy technical though. So, all right, I'm going to move on to demonstrating this, and we'll take the rest of the questions at the end, because we could spend the rest of the time on questions, and I think I just want to focus on teaching you stuff first. So if we go back to this image, this was my first take on the image, and one of the first things that I like to do is to increase the contrast. I found that a lot of times the first assessment that you're doing, when you just kind of punch in that threshold, it gives you some information, but sometimes not as much and not as useful as if you just increase the contrast. So when I punched up the contrast in this image, I could see almost immediately more of the problems, and you can see we're actually starting to approximate that two value composition as we punch up that contrast. And so that's the first thing I'd say. Punch up that contrast. You don't have to do it as a permanent thing. It could be a contrast layer just as an assessment. But I found personally, I tend to paint things at lower contrast, and then I find that my images get way better when I use the full range of the spectrum a little bit more. Doesn't necessarily mean that you always want to have the lightest lights and the darkest darks everywhere in the piece. That's all about composition. But when you're not utilizing the fact that you've got all of these kind of interesting things you can do with values, and the way that you can control stuff like how much of the lightest light to put in, you can't do that unless you actually are putting in the lightest light and the darkest dark, and that's kind of what that contrast shift did. So after that, I noticed a bunch of compositional problems, like some of the things that I talked about where we were peppering the view around everywhere, and that was a fairly easy fix. That one took a little while, so I did that before this session. You can see that I used atmosphere a little bit to do it. I brought up the light on this edge right here to control what's going on there and make it so that's not quite so high contrast. I removed some of these weird kind of black points here this was something that I found with the threshold layer actually. So when you turn on a threshold layer, I'm going to unlock this and we'll just put it on there. You'll see that you can take this value and you can roll it up and down. So this is another assessment method that I recommend, to drag this up and down, and you can see that we kind of get these weird darks pooling around that fence. It really is, you do this kind of rolling across the scene, it should look nice. It should feel like you're getting this nice representation of the scene in kind of like cross sections. And what's happening is we're getting these places where it becomes kind of abstract instead of feeling nice anymore. And so that's kind of what this is supposed to show you. So anyway, the other stuff that I used is some slight changes to the grass colors, changed some shadowing around the door and around behind the cottage here, trying to unify shadows a little bit more. And one of the things that's really nice about these techniques that I'm showing you is it does tend to drop your shadows into a closer range. I found that it's a really common problem that people use too wide of a range in their shadows. And if you bring those values together and then leave the broader value range in the light areas, just generally speaking, you end up with way better work. All right, so let's go and we'll now assess this piece, this now kind of adjusted piece, first of all as a color composition. And I think it's improved as a color composition. I do kind of wish that maybe we had something going on here, and maybe I'm thinking a third point somewhere possibly up here or in here. So maybe we'll keep it a triangle composition with the colors. So we'll start by giving this door a more saturated color. I don't know if I'll go with red, but it did look pretty nice before. So let's try and put some red or even maybe some purplish color in there. I'm using a color layer for this. And I'm going to use a cooler version of that color in the shadows. And I don't think we need to necessarily go that strong with it. I think I'll back off a little bit. However, I don't love the purple. So we're just going to roll a tiny bit more towards the reds and oranges. And then to kind of play off that a little bit better, I'm also going to introduce some blues. So we'll, rather than doing local color, I'm going to just use maybe some sky color down in this part. And maybe these are metal bands on the door, so we can actually reflect the sky off of each of those metal bands, and that'll give us some of that blue. And then to help kind of punch both of those up a little bit, what I'm going to do is I'll use an overlay layer, and I'm going to push some yellows, just where the sun is hitting the ground here. I'm going to put some yellows and oranges, and we can do a little bit of bounce light up on both those colors from that. And I realize that's too strong. We'll probably back off slightly. Find that's a thing that I do a lot when I'm painting, is I go too strong and back off, because otherwise I just have the tendency to be really, really timid. So I like that overall, but I don't think that the door needs to be quite as strong as it is right now. And I'm kind of wishing maybe the whole door leaned towards those oranges, like maybe they painted parts of the metal and it's wearing off or something. So let's do that. So you can still get some of the blues on the door, but maybe the door overall has a little bit more of the painted color to it. And what I'll do is I'm going to duplicate that image and we'll collapse it together just so we always have a point of reference and comparison. I found, by the way, saturated edges are a really great way of controlling composition as well. So you can do this in a subtle way, and it doesn't have to necessarily command a lot of attention, but like for example, if I do a saturated kind of orange right along this part right here, then it'll increase the interest around that door, and we can do it all without necessarily killing the color scheme, or by creating a contrast point that is drawing special attention to itself. It just adds a little bit of zing to that area. Zing is the technical term here. So let's bring some of those blues here into the rock. We've already got the yellows, so maybe we don't need to do too much with that. So I'm just going to bring a touch of the blues that we're doing everywhere else in here. And we already have some oranges to kind of pull our attention there. And I'm opposing those colors against each other to create a little bit of interest. And then I think I'm going to do just a little bit more with the texture right on this edge. We don't need to do a lot, but maybe like the rock is kind of flaking off and breaking down a touch here. So that little touch of detail ends up drawing some attention there, but it doesn't have to be like the most important part of the image. We'll just focus it in that one spot there. And then I think what I want to do is I don't necessarily want to draw attention to the background. I don't think we necessarily need a lot more up here, but because we have almost a line happening here with these points, I actually think we could draw attention to a couple things here. First, I really like this statue here, and I'm kind of thinking maybe a rim light. Could help pull that character out of the background a touch. And we don't necessarily want to draw tons and tons of attention to this character, so I'll keep it a soft rim light, but we'll keep the rim light there. It's like a down statue sort of thing. So I like the idea of, like, the former glory of some castle that once stood here, and now you have the humble farm that sits next to it. This, by the way, was a concept that I did for a game maybe, oh, what was it now? It was like 12 years ago or something like that. And so it's kind of fun to return to old pieces and improve them. And I kind of like the idea of maybe putting in the remnants of like a stained glass window up here. Again, kind of pushing that idea of this being this ancient old castle that's really cool. Maybe it's a little bit broken down so we don't get all the slats that go in between. We'll add a touch of a color edge here, and you'll notice that I saved our strongest color contrast for down here in this area, but everything else is kind of pulling through that path there. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to check our value composition, and I think there's a couple ways of doing it, and in this case I kind of think just rolling through the values is going to be the best way to do it. So as I go through basically the different versions of what this two value composition is, there's two things that you can do here. One is that you can you might find something that works really well as a composition, which then can guide the way that you adjust your values. Like maybe this works super well and you end up dropping all your shadows so that this whole area unifies better. Or it can do other things like, you'll discover in the movement of it that, this definition back here is really nice, but is it necessary that it be in the same value range as that? I kind of think it might be nice if it was a little darker or something, or maybe we brought those together a little bit so that we weren't getting so much of the cliff behind. So let's adjust some of this clip behind. And I think the easiest way to do that now is I'm going to think about this as a patchwork composition. And I'm actually going to blend together some of the values going across this background. So we have kind of a composition in the castle, and that becomes one composition. Then we'll cut it in half with shadow, and then we'll have another composition that sits down here. And best way to do this is probably going to be multiply layer, because multiply layer will allow us to bring some blues in on the colors that we've already painted. And I can just find the exact value of that feels like we've cast a shadow across it. I'm going to try to avoid the deep shadows, but it's okay if I hit them in a couple places, because I'll show you a way to kind of avoid that messing things up too much. Now we've got some atmosphere and light and everything kind of drawing our attention up here, but I honestly don't see any reason for it to be happening, that we're getting too much up there. So I'm just going to let all those values blend together a little bit more, like we got a big shadow. Maybe there's a mountain or a hill behind this castle over here, and that's what we're kind of leveraging as we do this lighting, is the potential of that. And I'll try and get kind of a soft gradient, because we don't want to draw attention to the shadow edge necessarily. And hopefully you can see already how that's improved the composition. We've really taken that light and forced our eye to move into the foreground or to move to the upper right, because we eliminated a lot of that information that sits in between. And we can actually keep some of these soft shadows that sit in between. Now, I said that I was going to not worry about cutting out the shadows as it sits in here. If you double click on the layer icon, then you can actually drag this up until it doesn't touch the shadows. And it must be using something that OBS doesn't like for streaming. Okay, so that seems like it's the threshold point at which I lose those shadows. So now I'm going to hold down Alt and kind of blend that out a little bit. Yeah, I think that works pretty well. I might bring some of that back in, but I like the effect that that's having. So let's now just do a little painting over the top of that. Now here's the nice thing, is that I've already created some layers here, and I can go back to those layers at any time if I want to see if what I did was successful. I think I might just do a little bit of the golden glow we're seeing back here, like the sunlight is coming around the corner, but then it's being overtaken by the shadows or something. So some of those things that we were doing with the cool light of the sun here, we could move it into that background. I would just bring the temperature a little bit cooler for the mountain as it sits back there. So maybe like more of a grayish green, and maybe rolling a little bit this way will look really good for the sunlight as it hits the distant stuff, but that really draws our attention. It draws it into the background more. And for this even more distant stuff, I'm going to go even grayer. And we can go up in value. But now our contrast between light and shadow should be decreasing. So we can put a little bit of light on those trees and stuff. A little bit of color magic there using saturation. Grays are kind of an amazing thing when you learn about them. All right, so we're not going to talk about that today. That's a lot to add into a lecture that should already be about composition, and we've got a lot to talk about. I'm going to go a little darker with this tree just to make sure that it separates from the ground, but I think it's okay if the atmosphere kind of allows them to bleed together. But I do think I want to go a little warmer with the heart of the tree as it sits in here. And I'd say go softer with your shadows in general when you move it out of the sunlight into shadow. You should never have hard-edged shadows in that sort of place. Okay, so I'm really liking how we've kind of isolated between the two. Let's check it with, first of all, our color composition. I think that works pretty well. And although I think I might pull some of the browns out of these upper areas, I don't know if we'll have time for that now. For the posterize filter, I think we fixed a lot of the weird stuff that was happening before with that area. The composition just got way better because of some of the elimination of information there. And then now we should be able to drag up and down here, and the composition should stay pretty solid as we roll across that cottage. There is a point where we start to get that hill in the background, but there's a nice isolation point right there where the cottage stands out great on its own and doesn't have anything competing with it for attention, which is exactly what we want. Now, for the sake of time, we got about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure that we're getting some of the questions that have come up during this period. It means that I won't have as much time to kind of push on this. But let me do one last thing just by way of demo. And that is that you can actually go to a 2 or 3 value composition and add in a compositional element and then change everything for that later. So for example, I can paint in a character here, and I'll just do it underneath this layer. So if I want somebody standing up here, I'll make it feel like a boy that's standing there kind of looking up at the stuff we've got there with the old ruins of the castle, kind of wondering about what was there in the past. And we'll make it so that this character reads really well in silhouette. I don't know if that's where the railing is, but we'll try and put his hand on it. And we'll try and do just enough shadow and light break up so that we can read what type of character it is. Put some kind of boots on him. And we'll of course try and make so that there's a cast shadow there, but I can't do that with this layer right now because I'm painting with the wrong color. Let's put a cast shadow in there for this character, which can actually go up this wall a little bit. And then we'll bring some light in on the tops of those boots. And then we probably have, I'm thinking maybe a little bit of shadow from that railing going across the legs. And now we have that character kind of standing out there. I think it's looking pretty good. And you'll notice that we just painted that in black and white, but here's what we can do now is we can lock a layer to that and now start painting it because we know it's going to work in the composition. So now it just becomes an issue of how we decide to paint this guy up in that area. I'd probably want to fill out this side of the face a little bit more, so let me put some shadows in there that I couldn't see, so that we can start painting this guy. But now at this point I would use that darken layer and start to, put some colors. Maybe this kid wears a blue shirt and he's got some brown pants on and maybe some darker boots. We'll make sure that his arms and skin kind of stand out up there, and we'll put some kind of armor on, gauntlets on his arms, and up around his neck we might do, I'm thinking, so that he feels like a farmer, we'll do kind of like a hay thing up there, and we'll keep his hair kind of blonde. And then of course we'd do a lighten layer, which would then allow us to bring up these shadows, so we can take some of these shadow colors that we so carefully figured out before, paint in some of those transitions and so forth. So like I said, I'm going to go to question and answer in the chat at this point, rather than really filling this in, but I wanted to show you how we could use both directions. You can go in from an analysis phase, or you can actually start with the stronger value composition and then add colors later. Okay, let's go into the questions. So how can you determine what compositions can go well together, like grouping and values or grouping and texture? Okay, when you're saying go together, I mean, like, I imagine you mean, can we use them in the same composition, or maybe you're saying when they can be laid on top of each other. You can use all of them in a composition. I think I would resist having to lay too many on top of each other. I would only do a couple of compositional elements at a time, unless you just want to totally blow people away with just that one compositional element. I mean, we're kind of doing that here at the door. It's like it's got the boy and the color of the door and the dark and light shadows. It's a lot. And so I think I would either move the boy somewhere else, maybe down here. Actually, that's a super easy thing to do. Let's just do it. We'd have to change the shadow, of course, but now by the law of proximity, that kid now stands out on his own and no longer competes with all the interesting things that are happening in the door. And we now have a shape that connects all those things together. That's pretty cool. It was more accident than not, but it's cool when that happens. When working on a given piece, do you prioritize 2 or 3 types of compositional hierarchies? Or do you use them all to continually assess the piece? So like I said, that's kind of what the same question that was already asked, but I will say I do prioritize for sure. Like I'll make it so that the image focuses on a couple things, and usually it's going to be about the story, the reason why I'm doing that. It's like if I want to spotlight something, it's going to be for story reasons. If I want to keep something in shadow, it's going to be for story reasons. If I want to make it so that something is blue against red, it's always going to be for story reasons. So that would be how I would answer that prioritization. Do you ever add all your values in gray and then color it? No, I do not. Some people do. I've done it before. It's just a pain for me. It takes twice as long to paint the painting when you do values first, then colors. That said, I do recommend it for somebody who really struggles with color, because the reason why I don't is because I've been painting in color so long, I'm just comfortable doing that. But if you struggle with color and you don't mind taking the extra time to figure it out, I think that can be a great way of approaching it. To do color. One thing I'd recommend though is that when you add the color, don't use a color layer, use a multiply layer, and then change your value layer so it's lifting up all at the top of the spectrum, so whites down into grays, because that will then give you the value range that you need in order to add that color. What are good exercises to practice composition? I would recommend thumbnailing. So thumbnailing is basically like the graphical composition thing that I told you, except you can iterate on a ton of compositions really quickly. It's a great tool. Of course, graphic composition is super useful as well in general. Let's see. Is it better to think composition at the start or to add it in later after you are done sketching? So I think there's going to be debate on this between different artists. For me personally, I am terrible at starting out thinking compositionally, and that's the reason why this is such a revelation to understand how these principles work, and how I can kind of go graphical later and kind of assess and modify things, because I make bad compositions from the start almost every single time, and then I fix it as I go. So that said, if you can, awesome, go for it. I think it'll make it better. Yeah, framed ink, by the way, some people are talking about that. I would strongly recommend it. Really great for this, for learning graphical composition as we're talking about it. I discovered this principle before learning about his work, and I've read the book since and thought I could actually like really dive in. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to return back to it, so I want to integrate and kind of fuse those ideas together. But anyway, let's see. How do I make strong contrast composition with a cloudy day or inside a blizzard where light and color lack contrast? So what you want to use then is local color. You're still going to have um, contrast in the lighting. Like there will be areas where there's less of the sky that can reach a certain area on a cloudy day, like under a stand of trees. So you can still use value contrast from the lighting, but what you're going to want to use almost more than anything else is local color. And when I say local color, I mean not just the hue, but actually the brightness of the local color to control the value contrast. Okay, how can we step up and start to bring our composition together with color? So when to start in color in general. So as far as exercises on doing that, so we talked a little bit about when to start with color already, but exercises to get good at color is I would actually do studies of photos, studies of paintings that you really like. Nathan Fowkes talks about doing thumbnails every day and just filling up a page with thumbnail studies of colors, and by the end you'll just have a really good sensibility for it. And I think that's a really good way of getting there, but it does take a little while. The other thing I'd recommend is try practicing color keys. Just carve out like a panel size and then try to tell a story using just color. That can teach you a ton. Okay, so we got 3 minutes left, so we'll just see if there's any last questions. Somebody says, if I make a traditional miniature landscape with clay and cardboard, will it help with lighting understanding? For sure, yeah. If you can actually build something and move the lights around and kind of understand how it changes things, it's like the disciplines of lighting and painting and design and staging, stage building, they're all interconnected. Sculpture, and when you learn something great from one, it can usually be ported very easily over to another. So yeah, if you can do it, I mean, it'll take you more time, but you'll learn a ton by doing that and understanding how moving elements around and changing the light position changes the way that the composition works. Do you have other books to recommend for composition? Earlier I was recommending Nathan Fowkes. Framed Ink is really good. Trying to think what others I'd recommend. I mean, that art and perception one is really important for understanding how complicated compositions work. So let's see. For backgrounds with flat colors, what would be the best way to create a great composition without showing highly rendered painting? So what I would recommend for that is if you're doing backgrounds and you want to start with flat colors, it sounds like that's what you're doing. So if you're doing a background with flat colors, then you need. Oh, actually, that question sounds like what you're talking about is something that's supposed to be graphical in the end, like a TV background. Hopefully, I'm getting this right. So if that's correct, then really what you're going to be using is very soft gradients where you need them. But for the most part, your value composition and your color composition are going to be a lot more like that slide that I showed you earlier. So where was it? Oh, I closed my image. So this slide right here, right? You're going to be thinking about how the sort of flat cutoff of things and how the detail breakup and the distances between things affect things more than anything else. All right, 5:59, we got maybe one more questions. So yeah, Graphic LA is a great book. You can learn a ton about that. Any tips for someone who tends to paint dark and make paintings with too much black or shadow? Okay, first of all, don't use black. What I'd recommend is start with a medium gray background and then half the value towards black as you're painting, and then use temperature rather than value in order to control things with the light and shadow. I think that will help you a lot. By the way, when you do this sort of graphic composition, obviously it's going to give you blacks and whites, and your final image, you're going to try to avoid the blacks and whites as much as possible unless you want to create something that feels really extreme. And usually, like I said, I'll use lighten layers and darken layers in order to even out that composition once it's created in black and white. Okay, well, that is all. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you later.